Hey guys, so I'm back recording a new series of post-mortems from my recent tournaments. I just got back from two events. The first one, which I'm going to be starting with today, was a GM Norm round robin tournament that took place in Minnesota towards the end of June. And the second event I played right after that basically was the World Open, which just finished a few days ago. Okay, so this was round one of the Minnesota tournament. So this was a 10-player round robin tournament, and we had our pairings a few weeks ahead of time. So there was definitely plenty of time to prepare for the event and get ready to play. The field was pretty even. Like most players were between 24 and 2,500 basically, and it was not clear, like that there were any outsiders or anything like that. It was just like a very tough event. I'm used to playing open events where you're like playing way down and then way up the next round, and this was different. This was like you're just playing a very strong player every single round. So in round one, I was playing against Grandmaster Andrew Tang, who I'm sure most people watching are probably familiar with, and he played his usual Queen's Gambit, declined. Here I played knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, bishop e7, and bishop f4. We actually got here through kind of a weird move order. Like typically Andrew usually plays this position with bishop e7. I'm not exactly sure why he decided to choose knight f6 against me, but this did give white the option to go for the classic exchange variation with takes, and bishop g5. I'm not sure what exactly he had in mind here, but obviously it's a super solid line for black and it would just lead to a different game. But I decided to stick to what I kind of expected was to get this QGD with bishop f4, which I've played a few times in the past. I think it's supposed to be a good line, but it's also super solid for black, so there's not much white can really do against the Queen's Gambit decline these days. You just kind of hope your opponent makes a mistake somewhere and maybe you can get a good position, but theoretically it's one of the most solid openings out there. Okay, so I played e3, black played b6, and this is just one of many lines that are available to black. I think knight bd7 is also considered theoretically pretty much fine for black. But okay, b6, of course nowadays everyone's discussing c5 at the top level, which I would actually be happy to see because this can lead to some really sharp fights where white can definitely fight for an advantage. But yeah, theoretically this move is also doing quite okay. So b6, bishop d3, c5, and this move actually caught me by surprise. I was aware that it's possible, but I really had no idea how white is supposed to fight for an advantage here. The typical move is like bishop b7, where I think we get a pretty reasonable and thematic position. But c5 is interesting because it really tries to clarify things in the center very quickly, and as I found out after the game, it doesn't feel like white has much here either, to be honest. Like maybe you can try to fight for a small like structural advantage, but there's really black is basically, I think, just okay here. So after some thought, I decided to take on d5. Knight takes d5. I traded knights, and e takes d5. I think this usually makes sense for black to trade off the knight here on d5. If they just go e d5, then I think white might be a little bit better, just because white is going to have well, more pieces in the game earlier on, and usually just helps black to trade off these knights on d5 here. So e d5. Now I decided to take on c5 and basically leave my opponent with hanging pawns. It's also possible for white to just castle here, but I was a little bit worried about black pushing c4 and then just getting this easy play with b5 and a5 going on the queen side, so I wasn't quite sure about this, and I decided just to take here. Then bc5 happened, castles, and bishop e6. And here, okay, I think maybe this is the moment where I start to kind of misplay things. I think the position should be about equal. That doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily be a draw, but it just means that it's kind of balanced. Because black's pawns on d5 and c5, I think it's really a matter of preference. Some players really like playing with the hanging pawns, and other players kind of prefer to play against them. I've always liked playing against these types of pawns because I feel like there's a lot of potential to, let's say, create a weakness and fight for a good outpost, which is always nice. But in this case, it's kind of just a balanced position. I think neither side has much of an edge here. Objectively, after looking at it a little bit, I feel like I should really analyze this position more. I feel like b3 might be a useful move here for white, and maybe the way to play this position. So it prevents black from, let's say, pushing with c4 under good circumstances. Not that black really wants to do this in every position, but it does, okay, put the pawn in a better square. The rook can come to c1, and I think white can still get a little bit of pressure here against these pawns. In the game, I decided to clarify things a little bit too quickly, I think, with this move e4. Optically, it looks nice because, of course, black really doesn't want to take on e4, and white's starting to take on d5 and leave black with this isolated c-pawn. But of course, the critical move is what happens after d4. And I felt like this advance was, I don't know, somewhat double-edged. Now I kind of feel like black is just totally fine here. To me, it seemed like, okay, I'm able to put my knight on d2, and I kind of created this c4 square for my pieces, so I have this like nice blockade going. But a blockade isn't necessarily such a great thing in every position. A lot of times blockades can just be passive, and you know, black can kind of build up. And yeah, I think this game kind of shows that black really didn't have many problems in this position. Okay, so knight d2, knight c6. I pushed a3 here just to stop knight b4. Black goes knight a5. I think this is a useful move. He's kind of fighting for the c4 square. Of course, I really can't allow him to push this pawn to c4, then black's pawns would really be rolling. So I played rook c1, rook c8, and knight c4. To me, this felt pretty natural, and we end up getting this position after some trades with queen b6, b3 takes, and rook takes c4, which I think was, yeah, pretty much just a very logical continuation once white pushed e4 and black pushed d4. And I wasn't sure how to evaluate this position during the game. To me, it felt like maybe white is fine, maybe it's a little bit double-edged. I definitely didn't think that white should be worse here. I mean, the d4 pawn is a protected passer, which is nice from black's point of view, but white does always have this idea to like break it up with b4. And optically, it looks like white's bishop is kind of a better piece than black's bishop because most of black's pawns are on dark squares. White's bishop is also controlling the b8 square, which is really nice because it makes it really hard for black to put any pressure on the b3 pawn. So this pawn on b3 is like a potential weakness, but at the moment it's difficult for black to put pressure on it. But okay, after playing the game, after analyzing it, I do feel like if anyone is better here, it's black because white has this nice blockade, but again, not a whole lot of active counterplay, whereas black can kind of try to slowly build up. And actually, this is kind of what happens in the game, because objectively the position is equal, but I definitely end up getting outplayed here a bit by Andrew. So okay, he goes queen e6, queen d3, f5. I thought this made a lot of sense just to try to trade off white's e4 pawn. Stockfish thinks white should have played rook e1. I don't know, to me this looked a little bit weird just to like take with the rook in some position like this where white's pieces look really awkward to say the least. But okay, apparently white is just fine there. What I did I think is also okay. I decided to take on f5, queen takes f5, and we end up getting this endgame where I guess most of the battle occurs. So yeah, I think I felt this was about equal, and that's probably right. If anyone is better, to me it looked like black is better because he has prospects of, let's say, bringing in the king, which if he can get his king to d5, then I think white's position would start to feel really uncomfortable, and black's d-pawn is definitely going to start to feel like a strength very soon. And like the bishop on e7 feels passive, but there's a saying like bad bishops defend good pawns, and also the bishop, I mean, is going to be able to support black's play like very easily very soon. So objectively, I think white is the one who really has to be more careful here. I chose g3. I think bishop d2 was also okay, but okay, I wanted to make luft. Black played king f7, and rook e1, important move to keep the king from coming into the center. rook d8, bishop d2, rook d7, and yeah, I think Andrew played this really well because he probably understood that he doesn't have a lot of chances to win here, but it's clear that he was trying to create some winning chances for himself. And yeah, objectively, there's not a whole lot Black can do, but just try to slowly improve the position, keep the game going, and hoping, you know, that White tries to do something a little bit rash and ends up, you know, giving Black some chances, because it's very hard for Black to really improve the position a lot further. Like, he doesn't have a lot of pawn moves and his king is kind of cut. But okay, chess is a game that's played between two players, and they both have to come up with ideas on every move, and so a lot of times mistakes happen just because you know, it's your move and you have to do something. So here I pushed b4. I don't think this move is a mistake. We could say it's not necessary, but okay, it has a very clear idea, just trying to trade off one of Black's pawns and try to loosen up the defense of the d4 pawn. So Black took on d4, on b4, bishop takes b4, and bishop d8. So I think this was a really good move because if the bishops were to get traded here in this position, it would be very, very drawish, and it would be very hard to create winning chances in a double rook endgame where White doesn't have, you know, any real weaknesses. So yeah, Black's only chance is to keep the bishops on the board. This keeps more imbalance in play, and I mean, actually the move makes sense because the bishop can come to b6 and start to target the f2 pawn, which we could say actually is a potential weakness with the bishops on the board. Okay, so I play king g2. I think this is pretty natural. Bishop b6 and f4. So I think this move is somewhat natural. It's kind of like securing the pawn and making sure that d3 doesn't come with any attack. It also kind of opens up the route for White's king to get in, but it's definitely, I would say, a mistake, and it kind of lands me in some trouble actually very quickly. What White should have done is actually just threaten kind of an annoying check with rook to c8. This is actually the main move I was considering in the position because it is kind of annoying for Black to deal with this. I want to go like rook f8 check, king will have to go to g6, then I can go like rook e6 check, and then Black's king is suddenly uncomfortable. He might have to go like rook f6, and yeah, I mean, this looked very natural from White's point of view. I just couldn't quite figure it out, like after, let's say, d3 for example, I thought might happen if I do go check rook e6, rook f6, and let's say I take with the f rook here. I wasn't quite sure how to evaluate this position. To me, it looked like Black's d pawn was quite strong, and Black's bishop on b6 is now really good, and so my bishop is probably going to have to go passive on d2, and then maybe Black gets some rook c7, rook c2 in, or maybe the king can try to come in. And yeah, I really wasn't sure what's going on here. It turns out this position is equal. I mean, White is fine after a few moves, so bishop d2 is okay. Rook e1 is also totally fine for White because now if d2, White will just play rook d1 and pick up the pawn. Also, bishop c3 is apparently working with the idea that after d2, which looks super dangerous, White can just take on f6 and seems to have at least a perpetual check here. Like if the king goes to g5, there'll be h4 check. If the king goes to h5, we have rook f5 check, and basically White can repeat the position, and this is a draw. But okay, bishop d2 is probably like an easier move to hold here. So yeah, I wasn't sure about that one. I decided to, you know, not to, let's say, risk it and go for this position where I thought I might be worse. But what I didn't realize is actually Black has a really annoying threat in the position, and that's to go a5, which doesn't look like much at first because now the pawn is going to be a potential target for White's pieces, and the bishop on b6 is now loose, so that might be in White's favor in some lines. But the point is, after bishop d2, Black has this move rook b5, and all of a sudden this rook is getting to activate itself. He's going to go either to b2 or b3, either putting pressure on the king or trying to win the a pawn. His d pawn is still really strong. I can't do anything to it, and now it just looks like Black's pieces are getting in, and Black has counterplay and White doesn't. White is just kind of super passive and trying to hold on. So already here I realized that something had gone really wrong, and all of a sudden I'm worse. After the game I found out that in this position White still had a way out with this move rook to c6. I actually considered this move. I didn't just play bishop d2 immediately because this counterattack looks nice. Again, if we can trade bishops, then white should have good drawing chances. But the problem is I just didn't see what to do against rook b5 here, where it looks like, okay, basically similar to the game, except I made this move rook c6, which might not be so useful because now I've given black kind of an extra tempo to get the counterplay going. So yeah, I didn't really see the point of including these moves, but the key resource that I missed here, which is pretty cool, is this move rook e5. And this actually saves the day for white. Hitting black's rook, black doesn't really have time to take the bishop on b4. If black takes on e5, white recaptures, and now both bishops are hanging, and this rook endgame is basically drawn because b takes a3, we have e6 check. So black is not really in time, and white is going to be winning back the pawn. And since, yeah, black doesn't really have much in that rook endgame, black doesn't have a ton of choices either because the rook is hanging. So this is just kind of leading to a draw. So yeah, I think after rook c6, black can still go like bishop d8 to keep the game going. But then white has like a better option for the bishop. I can play bishop c5, and here the bishop would be a lot more active. Okay, so I just didn't realize this resource was available, so I just played bishop d2, rook to b5, and okay, after some thought I decided to play like king h3 just to try to get the king out of the way, and if rook b3, I can put the bishop on c1 and cover the a3 pawn, which is passive, but I just didn't really see another way to deal with black's initiative. And so yeah, this is like a good example of how someone can drift, like from a seemingly very, very safe, calm position to something that all of a sudden becomes very, very dangerous. Okay, so he goes rook b2, bishop c1. Maybe rook d1 was better for some reason that I didn't really understand from Stockfish. But okay, I play bishop c1, rook b3, rook c6, and here he pushed d3, which during the game looked extremely natural and good, and already I was feeling super uncomfortable here, like I was just much worse and about to lose. Apparently he had a much stronger move in bishop to d8. The point of this move is actually that it's just simply freeing black's rook from defending the bishop on b6, and in doing so it all of a sudden ties white's bishop down to this a3 pawn, and so yeah, it just makes things kind of worse for white because now black can put the bishop on f6 and then push the pawn to d3, and yeah, all of black's pieces are going to be super strong. So that was a nice resource. But okay, d3 felt very, very natural during the game. I played bishop d2. I guess now kind of utilizing the fact that my a pawn is not really hanging. Rook b2, rook d1, and he went bishop d8. Now he's freeing the rook. I played a4 and rook c2. And yeah, this looked like a pretty strong move to me, because now I'm forced to make a decision. If I trade rooks, then I'm just immediately losing after d takes c2. And if I go rook a6, as happened in the game, then the a5 pawn is not really hanging. So after rook a6, rook a2, I can't take on a5 because of rook takes a4. And white will be losing material. So yeah, I mean, both options were bad, but I guess rook a6 is definitely the lesser of two evils. Turns out I missed another move here though, rook c3, which yeah, suddenly somehow didn't cross my mind because I don't know, I think it just looks quite strange, but concretely it's just a very good move. I'm defending my rook, and the point is after rook a2, my rook is still active enough that I can play rook c4 and keep things under control. And here I think, okay, white is worse, but still holding on. Okay, so I played rook a6, rook a2, and now I realized, I'm losing the a4 pawn, or maybe I realized on the previous move, but at this point I have to just do whatever I can to try and hold the position. I decided that my best chance here would be to, let's say, bring my king in a little bit closer to the center. I think this is useful because in some lines maybe the king can help deal with black's d-pawn. And I also actually just wanted to start pushing my kingside pawns because I felt like if I have any chances in this game, it would be to maybe create some counterplay, because if I continue to sit passively, then pretty soon black is going to be able to take the a4 pawn, and once black gets an extra pawn, then you know, passive defense will never work. So yeah, he takes on a4, king f3, rook a2, and h4. And I didn't really have a grand plan or anything I had in mind when I started pushing these pawns. I think at this point we were already in heading towards time trouble. The time control for the event was just 90 plus 30 flat, so 90 minutes plus 30 seconds per move. And so that means that, yeah, once you get low on time, you don't really gain it back so easily. There's no second time control. So I think I only had like a handful of minutes left at this point. I figured, okay, you know, I have nothing to lose. Might as well just start throwing some pawns down the board, hoping to get some counterplay. He pushes as well, a4. After the game, we thought maybe it would be a better idea for black to have played h5 here, which really slows white down a lot, because now whenever I play g4, of course, I'm splitting my pawns and kind of weakening my structure. Apparently things are not super clear here just yet, like black is better, but white actually does have some ideas here, because now I still want to go h6, open some lines, and then maybe one day I can try to like activate my bishop, activate my second rook, and even start, you know, getting some checks against black's king. It's always vague, it's never clear if this is really going to amount to anything, but it does seem quite annoying for black to deal with, and yeah, I think it would still offer white some good practical chances. But okay, in the game, a4 was played. I pushed h5, a3, g4, so I'm just pushing away. And the only thing in my favor is that I do have both of black's pawns under control. Like the d pawn is thoroughly blockaded, and my rook is behind the a pawn, which makes it not so simple for black to queen it. Because if he wants to get his rook out of the way, he has to first defend the pawn. And if one day he can get his pawn to a2 and then put the bishop on f6, by then I will have already pushed g5, and so black won't be able to do so, and the pawn will be kind of stuck. So, okay, he goes bishop e7, g5, rook b2, and f5. I thought about throwing in g6 check here, but I really wasn't sure whether I should or not. It was really hard to figure out how exactly I should time the counterplay, but to me it looked like I still have another move until black plays a2, so I might as well play f5, and now g6 is likely stronger, because I can also think about maybe playing against hg. F takes g6, and the f pawn I think can play a role as well. So a2, g6. I really wasn't calculating a whole lot here. It was more of a, like, this is just the only idea I have in the position, so I might as well play it. And yeah, like I mentioned, we were both running somewhat low on time here, so there wasn't a whole lot of time to really calculate, but rather just look for the best idea you can find and go for it. Okay, so he took on g6. I decided to take hg. Ultimately, the reason I wanted to do so was that this opens up the h-file for a potential rook swing, and maybe I can try to get to h8 if he runs to e8. This is actually what happens in the game. fg was also a possibility. I mean, in both cases, the king doesn't really want to go to g8 because there are potential back rank tricks. For example, king g8. I think Stockfish points out this move, rook e1, is very strong for white, just running rook a8 check and then threatening mate. And I think black has to be very careful here, and actually white has already enough counterplay for a draw, because I'm probably just going to be able to pick up this a2 pawn really soon. So yeah, I definitely considered fg as well, because the other point being that if the king runs to e8, then maybe I might have some ideas to play like h6 and just get my own pass pawn all of a sudden. And I really wasn't sure what's going on here during the game. It turns out after g takes h6, rook e1, again, white has enough counterplay for a draw. It's still a really sharp position. It seems like all three results are possible because white's g pawn is really strong. But black should have a way to kind of like bail out here and not lose the game. I mean, it looks tremendously sharp. It would definitely not be easy for black here. Yeah, I mean, during the game, I wasn't sure at all about what's happening here. To me, HG looked like the way to go because of this rook h1 idea. Black played king e8. If king g8, I'm not sure if I would have found the move, but again, rook e1 is I think the only way for white to actually create enough counterplay for a draw, basically. Otherwise, white just doesn't have enough threats. Like if I give a check right away, then black can either go bishop d8, I think, or maybe rook d8 might be even cleaner. And the problem is, in the long run, this a pawn is so strong that black's bishop is coming to f6, the rook is coming to c2, and this is just going to be really dangerous for white. I mean, here maybe there are some tricks like bishop c3, for example, and if rook c2, white is in time to play rook takes d3, hitting the bishop on d8. So it's still a very, very concrete position, but I think black should be doing quite well here. Maybe bishop d8 is a better move. I'm not totally sure. But okay, so in the game, king e8 was played. I think from black's point of view, this does look like the safer move because it seems like there are less back rank tricks, but actually after rook h1, black still has some issues to solve. And yeah, I really, again, wasn't sure what's going on here. I just kind of played this move instinctively, you know, that it just seems like the most dangerous move in the position. Andrew took a little bit of time here. He took the bishop on d2. I'm not sure if black really has a better move, but he has to kind of accept the sacrifice. Rook h8 check, bishop f8. And this was a really important moment because, of course, it looks like white can just win back the bishop with rook a8 check. And then if king e7, we can take, or if rook z8, then white can take both pieces and win the piece back. But I felt like this rook endgame would be extremely dangerous for white, if not just immediately losing. I think what I calculated was that black is in time basically to get both of the pawns to the 7th rank. So let's say rook b1 for rook b2, for example. King e3, d2, king e2, and yeah, basically black wins either with rook b1 and then queening one of the pawns, or d1 is also perfectly good with rook b1 and a1 to follow. So once I realized that this simple rook endgame is basically just lost, like there's not much white can really do to save it, just simply not in time. You know, I didn't want to just go for it. I wanted to look for more options. And then literally at the very last moment, I actually found the right move here, which was f6. And this turns out to just be a very, very strong breakthrough that just gives white tons and tons of counterplay in the position. Because now the threat is to give a check on a8 and then take on g7, which will allow white to queen and potentially queen with check and just make the black king. And so it's actually very, very difficult for black to handle this. Basically, the only move is to play g takes f6, which was played. But now this gives white a really strong pass g-pawn. So rook a8 check. And now the same rook endgame is a lot more unclear because white has this pawn on g6. So for example, rook takes f8, king e7. Here white can... I'm not sure about g7. I think black probably will checkmate us first, but I think rook a8 here is very annoying to deal with because black simply doesn't have a good way to stop the pawn. Might have to give up the a pawn in order to bring the king back around, but then if black gives up the a pawn, white will be able to win the d pawn as well, and eventually we'll be left with an endgame where black has one extra f pawn and white's king will be close enough that we can reach the drawn Philidor position. It's kind of what happens in the game. Yeah, basically a nice illustration of, even though white is like 2 pawns down, but has enough activity to save this endgame. So after rook a8 check, black played king e7. I think he realized that endgame is not going to be winning. So he wants to keep 2 rooks on the board and keep more chances alive. I took the bishop. King e6. I think this move is necessary because white is actually now threatening to push g7, and optically it feels like white's g-pawn is actually stronger than any of black's pawns because again, my rook is very nicely placed behind the passed pawn. It's very hard for black to push the pawn through because it's just going to be hanging. This rook on d2 especially is just a super passive piece. It's blocking black's other d-pawn and simply hasn't had time to get out of the way yet. whereas white's g-pawn is completely unimpeded and is just ready to promote. So king e6, he covers g7. I gave a check from a6, king e5, and rook f7. I was basically playing on the increment at this point, but I felt like my moves were just very clear. Like, I have one pawn left, I'm going to try to promote it, and that's all I can really do. And I'm going to try to keep my rook on the a file as long as possible and not let black promote any of his pawns. So rook d8, g7. Now the threat is rook f8. My king, I should mention, is also very nicely placed because it's covering black from being able to defend against the pawn from behind. So now he's forced to play rook g8 because otherwise rook f8 was a big threat. Okay, and here I realized, I should be in time to draw the position because my pieces are much more active and my king is actually useful too. And I calculated a little bit here and I figured out that king e3 is definitely good enough to make the draw. Because now black has to start losing some pawns, and once one pawn goes down, the second pawn also falls, and like I mentioned, black is going to be left with this one f pawn. Okay, so he goes rook g2. I think it was probably the best chance in the position. I took on d3, rook g3 check, king e2, and rook to g1. So I actually missed not this idea, but just that this move was possible. What I'd mainly considered was that black was going to take here, and then after rook takes, it's very important that I can't take on a2 because of rook g2 check, and I have to be very careful not to allow rook g1 next move, that I have a move like either, let's say king f3 is probably the safest, getting off of the second rank, and now it turns out that black simply has no way of saving the a2 pawn, so I'm going to win this pawn back, and then my king is in the perfect drawing zone for the final endgame. So I was aware of this idea. When he played rook g1, it was a little bit surprising because I hadn't considered the move in the position, but I quickly realized that, okay, I don't have to take the pawn, I can just play rook a7 and double up behind the a pawn and prevent it from promoting. So he takes on g7. I think I could already just take here and revert to the previous position where white goes king f3, picks up the a pawn, and we have a drawn endgame. I decided to throw in a check because I thought this was easier, because actually black's king doesn't have such a great way of getting out of the perpetual checks, it seems, as if the king crosses over to the g file, then I can just take on g7. But actually he does have a way out, which I realized in time. After rook a4 check, king f5. Giving this check I think would be somewhat unnecessary because after king to g6, white is still fine with just rook takes a2, and black just can't do anything. We're going to be trading rooks soon and getting a draw. But of course the main pitfall to avoid would be trading rooks, because after king takes g7, white would not be in time to take the pawn because of the skewer trick, and is also not in time to get the king out of the way because the rook is already on the back rank. So this would just be a losing position for white. So after he played king f5, I said, okay, now it's time just to simplify the position, trade one pair of rooks. In case of rook takes g7, again, white has king f3, and black has no way of defending the a pawn. Instead, he played a1 equals queen. I took on a1, rook takes a1, rook b7, and now the main point to understand is that white's king is simply in the correct spot to defend against black's passed pawn. I can easily draw using the Philidor defense, and yeah, I no longer had any trouble holding this game. So Andrew tried for a little bit, but it was basically not much black could do here because okay, I understood the defense pretty clearly. The main point for those wondering is that you can also do this on the third rank, is you're trying to keep the king cut off along this rank, and as soon as black pushes f4, let's say trying to bring the king forward, now is the exact time for white to bring the rook to the 8th rank and then give a lot of checks from behind. I'm sure many people watching already know this, so it's kind of repetitive, but if you don't, I would recommend you check out some longer, more detailed video on YouTube about it, because it is definitely a very fundamental endgame to know. A lot of rook endgames end up kind of boiling down to this one pawn endgame, where if you don't know the defense, you could be in trouble, but if you know it, then you can hold a draw basically against any player in the world, which is kind of a nice feeling. So yeah, we played on for a few more moves here, but the game was eventually drawn. And yeah, I mean, solid start to the tournament. You know, I drew with one of the higher rated players, one of the GMs. The field, I'm not sure I mentioned, was like 3 grandmasters as usual, and 7 norm seekers, like mostly IMs. So yeah, I mean, the result was good. I was a little bit disappointed with how the game played out, because I felt like, you know, at the start, I wanted to at least put some pressure on him, but from the game, it's clear, like, you know, white was never better at any point. It was kind of black pushing the whole time, and at a certain point, my defense was not up to par, and I was really very close to losing, I thought. I feel like I just kind of got lucky at the end by, like, pushing all these pawns. All of a sudden, you know, I had counterplay in the position, and somehow it was enough to make a draw. So yeah, I was not super happy with how I played the game, but I was happy that at least I had kind of buckled down and saved it. Like, I found some counterplay and I didn't collapse. So that was definitely I would say, like, let's say a bit of good momentum for the tournament. The fact that I was able to kind of hold like a really bad position. Okay, that wraps it up for this game. I'll see you guys in the next videos. Take care.